Today I'm going to be breaking down a light meter. So first off, what is a light meter? Well, for starters, here's a little history lesson. Before digital cameras and HD onboard monitors, we had film. Film was the medium used in all major movies. With film, you didn't have any monitors showing you your image in real time. You just had an optical viewfinder. So the only way to know if your shot was going to be dark or too bright or just right was by using a light meter. So fast forward to now. You might be asking, well, if we have monitors, do we really need to know how to use a light meter? And I think so. Monitors can be deceiving. If they're not calibrated correctly, you might be looking at a version of your footage or your image that's either deceivingly bright or dark, and the last thing you want to do is get into post-production and wonder why your footage is under or overexposed. And a light meter will never lie. So in today's breakdown, that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to show you what a light meter is, how it can function, and how you can use it to improve your work as a cinematographer. A quick disclaimer, when kind of discussing a light meter, there is a lot of technical jargon that I do think is important, but for the sake of just education and kind of understanding that a lot of you watching this have probably never really used a light meter or have never really set one up, I think that technical stuff can sort of discourage people from using it. For instance, a light meter functions off of 18% gray, and certain cameras have different IREs and different gamma profiles. And me even just saying that right now, I feel like I lost a lot of you. So that's what I'm going to avoid. I'm framing this video in a way that's not going to alienate any people. My goal with this is if you've never used a light meter, maybe I can turn you on to purchasing one, and how by inputting a couple simple variables into the light meter, it can be a great tool to have. So with that, I'm going to jump right in. Number 1, incident light meter. This is an incident light meter. Some light meters also have a spot meter function too, but we'll get to that later. An incident light meter can easily be recognized by its dome. This dome is supposed to mimic the roundness of your subject's head. And it sounds silly, but if you think about it, your head is round and, light hitting you from the front will likely begin to fall off as it wraps around your head. And the dome of the incident light meter is essentially metering light to factor this, roundness in. Number 2, how does it work? So at this point, you must be wondering, how does this tool work? So to start, there are 3 things that affect the brightness of your image: ISO, shutter, and aperture. So when you're shooting a scene, there are 2 out of those 3 that will likely never change. Or if they do, once you set them, they'll live there for the duration of your scene. And those 2 variables are ISO and shutter. So for instance, if we were shooting a narrative scene, 99% of the time, if we were on a modern digital cinema camera, we would leave the ISO at 800. And this can kind of vary, your base ISO might be a little bit different, but for the most part, the ISO will likely always be at 800. And your shutter is kind of another constant. In most circumstances, your shutter is going to be at a 1/48 or 180 degree shutter. So knowing that, you just input those 2 constants into your light meter. You set your light meter to 800 ISO and you input your shutter. To do the shutter, it does involve a few steps. First, you need to start by selecting the current frame rate that your camera is shooting at. So in most cases, this would be 24 frames a second. Once this is selected, you'll need to double check your shutter angle. And on this meter, this can be done by pushing the buttons mode and ISO 2 at the same time. This brings up the shutter options, and by adjusting the toggle wheel, you can set your shutter angle to whatever you're shooting at. But in most cases, if you're shooting sort of a narrative project, your shutter angle is going to be 180 degrees. And if you're using a camera like a DSLR that maybe doesn't give you the functionality to do angle, but it's shutter speed, this would be basically a 1/50. So if you're shooting on a DSLR and it's 1/50 or 1/48, your shutter angle in the light meter just needs to be set to 180. And that's it, you are set. Your light meter is now perfectly in sync with your camera settings. Now when you put the light meter near your subject's face and click the meter, you're going to get a reading that gives you the final ingredient. It gives you an aperture reading. Because remember, when I said that there are 3 things that affect the brightness of your image, so, like I said, to recap, your meter knows the ISO and shutter. We already inputted those. And by knowing those 2 things, it gives you the 3rd aspect, which is the aperture. Now, if you set your aperture to what the light meter is indicated, your image is technically properly exposed. It really is that simple. I mean, I usually use my meter to get two types of readings. Number one, I'll get a key side reading. So I would put the meter on the key side of my subject's face, making sure the dome of the light is facing towards the key light, and then I would click and get a reading. Number two, the second reading I would get is a shadow or a fill side reading. I would put my meter on the shadow side of my subject's face and make sure the dome is pointed towards the fill side. You may need to flag off the key light with your hand so it doesn't accidentally give you a false reading. Because remember, any light hitting the dome will influence the reading. The reason I get these two readings is so I can see the contrast ratio. Remember, contrast ratio is the ratio between key and the fill side or shadow side of your subject's face. So for instance, if I go in, I get a key side reading that say is an f4, and my fill side or shadow side reading was an f2.8. There is a one-stop difference between the key and the fill side. So now as a DP, you can take this information and adjust your lighting accordingly. If you're going for a low-key scene, you actually may want to increase this contrast ratio, making the stop difference between key and fill larger, maybe lowering that shadow side, or if this was like a high-key beauty commercial, you could use these two light readings of the key and the fill, and maybe you need to balance the fill out so that the key side and fill side are actually reading the same exact. So yeah, these two readings, key side and fill side, are kind of my go-tos when I'm lighting and trying to get a reading on my subject's face. And one last little thing too, when you are going in for a light reading, definitely have a dialogue with the actor or actress and say, hey, I'm gonna get a light reading, before just shoving this light meter in their face. And the best results, you're gonna get the most accurate results when the light meter is very close to their face. Avoid being a couple feet away and clicking and getting a light reading, because you'd be surprised, even just that little distance away from the subject's face is gonna kind of hinder the accuracy of this light meter. Here's a quick tip to keep in mind when using your light meter. When you are metering, the meter does not know that you have ND filters in. So if your ISO and shutter are input into your meter, but you also have an ND 1.2, which cuts 4 stops of light, your meter does not know this and will give you a reading that's no longer helpful or accurate to you. So here's the tip. Each time you cut the ISO in half, that is one stop. So going from ISO 800 to ISO 400, that's one stop. Going from ISO 400 to 200, that's another stop. So knowing this, you can cut your ISO in half multiple times until you arrive at the amount of stops of ND you are using. So by kind of looking at this graphic, if you had an ND 12 in your camera, you can easily factor this into your light meter by reducing the ISO in your light meter in half 4 times to reflect 4 stops. So to recap, by changing my ISO in the light meter from ISO 800 to ISO 50 would reflect cutting it in half 4 times, resulting in 4 stops of light. And I know that sounds kind of confusing. The thing to factor in is your light meter, you just need to trick the light meter into being 4 stops darker. And the quickest way I've found to do this is just by halving your ISO for every ND you have. So if you had an ND 3, you would, that's 1 stop, you would cut your ISO in the light meter from 800 to 400. Or if you had an ND 12, you would do this 4 times. Like I said, you're not changing your ISO in camera, you are just changing the ISO in the light meter to basically kind of trick it into thinking you have an ND in there by halving the ISO. Number 5, a spot meter. A spot meter functions very similar to an incident light meter. You're still inputting, your ISO, your frame rate and shutter, but the way it captures a light reading is different. Where an incident meter functions off of a light dome and light hitting the dome and giving you a reading, a spot meter kind of functions like a pair of binoculars. If you have a spot meter on your light meter, you essentially are looking through an optical viewfinder, and wherever you point the optical viewfinder, it's going to tell you the exposure of where you're pointing it. I do find this is less accurate or helpful for pointing it at an actor's face and get a reading, so I do strongly recommend still using an incident meter to get your exposure readings on your subject's face. But where a spot meter is very effective is for bright or dark spots of your set. If you have a bright window, a bright light bulb, or maybe even a dark corner of your set, and you just want to get an idea of the values of those areas, busting out the spot meter, sort of pointing it at that spot of the set, you can get a really good idea of how bright or how dark certain areas are. but just me personally, I use the incident meter 90% of the time and really only bust out the spot meter if I'm really just trying to target a specific spot on the set. And number 6, recap. Hopefully I've done a good job explaining how to use a light meter effectively to sort of give yourself another reference point for exposure. I think we're very blessed in this day and age as cinematographers to have HD monitors and a pretty accurate way with false color and other tools to get a good idea of exposure. And though a light meter seems like it's from another era, from film and shooting on 35 or 16 millimeter, where this was the way to gauge exposure, I think this is a great tool to have on set as a DP. But yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. Hopefully this helped. I strongly recommend getting a light meter. They do make some as cheap as a couple $100. The thing to look for though is a lot of light meters are geared for the photography community. So try to get a light meter that says cine or definitely stresses that it can be used for digital cinematography.